Okay, I haven't done this in a while. It's been a long time. I don't even recognize half the faces here, but... So I'm going to call the meeting to order and call for a roll call.
Chair Smithers.
Here.
Vice Chair Chateau.
Here.
Committee Member Barr.
Here.
Caldwell.
Here.
Dell.
Here.
Feeney.
Here.
Knight. Neiman.
Here.
Park.
Here.
Sylvestrin.
Here.
And Smith.
Okay. So if anybody has any comments associated with the SHAPE committee that would like to come forward, that items not on the agenda, they certainly can do so.
John Thurine, 497 Crane. Simple question. Is there a list, an itemized list of the entities that SHAPE has looked at or is going to be looked at that's available for the public to also look at?
Well, it's not entities, it's facilities. So it's different buildings and that sort of thing.
Right, but I mean, is there a list of those that...
Yeah, in fact, if you access the SHAPE committee agenda,
Yeah.
there's actually an 850-some-odd page report that has all the facilities in there, the assessments of them, as well as appraisals for them and space considerations and that sort of thing.
And is there any way of knowing when any one of those is going to be on the agenda for any particular meeting?
Well, tonight, EMG is going to go through a presentation, a summarized presentation of all the facilities and the assessments of those with some appraisal data. And then to the extent that we're going to specifically talk about any of those facilities or the committee's going to have ideas, it'll end up being posted on the agenda. And actually later tonight, we're going to go through a calendar of our future agenda, which obviously can change, but to give people some ideas as to how it's going to roll out.
That's how it's going to roll out is simply exactly what I was hoping to get. Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else? Okay. I think before we get to consent items, well, I guess we can do the consent items. We have consent items 4.1 and 4.2, which are the minutes for December 6th and December 13th. And I don't know if anybody has any comments on those or amendments. Otherwise, we can just agree to accept the consent items with a roll call. No, go ahead. You want to... Yeah, I guess we have to make a motion and a second and all that stuff.
Remember how to turn on the mic. So, I move to accept the minutes from both those meetings.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Yeah.
Yes. All opposed?
Okay, so just before we get to new business, Tim said he had a couple of comments, and I want to just go ahead and let Tim make those comments before we get into the heart of the...
Left button.
It's nothing's moving. Yeah. Okay, we'll have to share mics tonight.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I missed the last couple of meetings. I listened to them from a hotel room, but it was kind of hard to participate that way. I had a couple of comments about the process in particular. It seems like in the last meeting in particular, and a lot of the meetings that we've had up to this point, there's been a lot of discussion and I guess some anxiety in the group about what the scope is for this committee's purpose, and in particular the process. And there's been a fair amount of energy trying to sometimes jump to the end. People are very anxious to make recommendations and start proposing solutions. And I think we're way too early to even be having those sorts of discussions. I do this sort of work with big organizations where we frame and structure decision problems. And my take on this is that we're actually in really good shape. We're about where I would expect to be in this process. We're still very early in it. We're way back at the framing stage. We still have a lot of work to do to frame this problem. So it just seems way early for us to be kind of proposing solutions. We have a lot of work left to do. And I think Mark and Allison and Mark have a good process in place to get us there. For me, there are at least 3 elements to the frame that we haven't even talked about sufficiently yet, and that we need to build before we start talking about any analysis, before we get to talking about trade-offs and proposing solutions. And those 3, the first one is just the problem definition itself. Most of what we've been doing up to this point in time is talking about the nature and extent of the city's problem. And I'm not sure I fully understand that yet. I think what we're going to discuss tonight will go a long way towards kind of fleshing that out. The second part of the frame is the one that's all over our schedule. It's the identification of alternatives, kind of putting all the puzzle pieces together and hopefully coming up with a really creative and diverse set of possible alternative strategies for the city. And the third piece, and I'm not sure how this is built into the schedule. I know there's some plans in upcoming meetings to talk about the kind of the decision-making process that we're going to follow. But for me, one of the other things that's missing from the frame is an identification of the decision criteria that we're going to use to choose between all of these alternatives that we put together. And I think it would make sense at one of our upcoming meetings for this group to talk specifically about what those criteria are. The city has a number of criteria that are primarily related to money. The city is looking for funding for capital projects, which further feed into objectives that have to do with infrastructure, maintaining city facilities, a new or improved city hall, and so on. I think it would make sense for this group to articulate specifically what each of those objectives are and to come up with criteria for each one in a measurable way so that when we get to discussing alternatives, we can put them side by side and we can assess how well does each alternative satisfy those criteria that the city is hoping to fulfill. In addition to those city-inspired criteria, the public cares about a lot of other impacts. And these are the ones that are, they're livability types of things. It's traffic, housing, water, open space, et cetera. And the alternatives that we're going to generate will invariably impact some of those things. People care about them. They're relevant to the decisions. I think it would behoove this committee to also go through and try to list each of those things as criteria and talk a little bit about how we're going to capture those in the process. And from my standpoint, if we could get to that point, if we've got a good, diverse set of alternatives and we have talked about and developed a combined set of decision criteria, then we've got a good frame built and we're ready to move on to analysis and then eventually to the really hard part, talking about trade-offs. So I think we're moving in that direction. I'm not sure if we're actually going to do it in the sequence that I talked about, but it seemed like there's just been a lot of anxiety in the group about the process. And from my experience, having done dozens and dozens of problems like this, we're in pretty good shape right now. And I think if we kind of work together step by step, we're going to get there in good shape. So those were my comments.
Great, thanks. Anybody else want to make any comments before we get on with the agenda?
I just wanted to mention one thing, and that is the last meeting we had was the financial analysis of the city. And I think the way that information was disseminated and made it into the public's ears was a bit of a disservice to them, because people up and down Main Street will say, oh, we don't have any problems. Financially, we're okay. We're healthy. And I think it's important to say that while the city is not insolvent, we certainly have a long way to go via analysis and trade-offs and things like that to making us a healthier financial city. So I just, even though there's some money in the account, I don't think it means that we're okay. I think it means that we have a little bit of money to address some problems, but we don't really have the reserves necessary to take care of the long-term challenges that we face. So that's my 2 cents.
I don't know if Mark or anybody wants to comment on that. My general feeling is, from listening to that presentation and reviewing some of the financial numbers that I've seen, I actually want to give somewhat more of an opposite view. I think from a general plan operating perspective, I think we're extremely healthy. Right now, we're allocating monies to fixing roads and fixing certain things that we couldn't have done in the past, and I think the reserve, although I think it's maybe come back a little bit because they've allocated monies now to, I think, an environmental impact report related to the general plan and whatnot, but I think the reserve sits somewhere between 30 and 34%, which is tremendous. I mean, I don't even know that the reserves in this town need to be 20%, given if you look at historically what's happened during any sort of recession and what's happened to sales tax and TOT, which maybe drop collectively $1 million during a recession. So I think we're really, really healthy. That's not to say that we don't have a lot of buildings that are in, very, very poor shape, depending on how you want to say it's poor or fair or good. But I think we all recognize that. But as they said that night, if we didn't have this committee and we weren't going about this process, then they probably would have assessed the shape of our facilities a bit differently. So I'm gonna not agree with you on the fact that we still. I mean, we have things to do, but again, we can pay our bills, we can hire people, we can get stuff done. Water, wastewater has their own issues, but that was addressed previously, and that's large. And I think we're now addressing this. And I think, given the operating budget and cash flows, before you consider other capital improvements, which would be roads and some other items, there's a fair amount of cash there to decide what you want to do, which is probably going to help us, fund some of these facility needs on maybe take on some debt. So I think we're actually in pretty good shape. I don't know, Mark, if you want to say anything.
Not at this time. I think we've used the word stabilizing, and it's intentional because it refers to where we've been and where we are and where we're going. So hopefully that's helpful.
I'd just like to make a comment, and that is, if both of you are disagreeing on just the fundamentals, then I think we have a problem going forward, because it really comes down to, okay, we have the money to operate as a city, meet payroll, ongoing expenses, but do we have the serious depth of dollars over the next 10, 20 years to take care of the big issues that are looming out there? Because there's a lot of assets that are just kind of crumbling, falling apart. They're very expensive. We've kind of talked a little bit about roads, and yet we haven't really have analysis of how much do we really need to bring all the roads up to good condition for the next 10, 20 years. So I think that what Jeff is alluding to is that the fundamentals aren't really solid amongst all of us as far as how we're reacting to these numbers yet. And some of it's leaking out into the public, because I myself am running into people saying, hey, I understand everything's great. We're financially solvent and we're doing great. And I'm going, well, but we don't have really the big depth of dollars to deal with a lot of these structures. And somehow I can't get them back on board to see the big picture. Once they hear the good news, I can't get them to come back. So I am a little bit worried about what's being promulgated to the public here, because even if amongst ourselves, if we're not on board to have a meeting in the minds about the numbers and the reality, then it gets a little kind of fuzzy going forward when we try to talk about Tim's talking about as far as gelling all this analysis and bringing it together and coming up with a game plan. So that's my take.
I'd like to go back to what Tim said.
I'm going to have to jump in here and just encourage one of the concerns that I have is that we're moving away from the agenda. And it's very important that we speak to the items on the agenda pursuant to the Brown Act. And I think a lot of the questions and comments that that you're raising partly are going to be dealt with in time, in future meetings in some cases, in other cases tonight, because you're going to hear about new numbers tonight that are part of the information that this committee will be confronted with. And in a future meeting in the near future, we're going to bring in and this is on the tentative calendar that we'll talk about a little bit later, a consultant that will speak to strategies to deal with the financial realities that we have, whatever those are. And so I would encourage us to postpone these types of conversations for now and move to the new business items that are on the agenda tonight, if that's okay.
I guess, given the fact that, yes, I agree with that, given I'm the chairman, I guess I can have the last word on this, and I think Tim was echoing this, and this is what I've been saying since day one. There's a process. We have to go through the process. We have to get the baseline data. That's part of what we're doing here today. So we can't jump ahead into these other avenues and discussions until we really have all the data. So that's what we have to do. We have to follow the process. So I think we're going to cut this off at this point in time, and I think Mark's going to introduce our folks from EMG.
Yes, sorry for being the bad guy here. Tonight is a very important piece to your puzzle, because you've heard a lot about the city's finances, and in context you're going to hear more as we bring the long-range financial forecast forward in the near future. And tonight this is a very important piece, and I know there's been interest in talking about what to do with these assets, but this tonight fills in a very important piece, which is what is the value of these assets, what are their current conditions, what does it cost to put them back together in the current year, and what are the recommended investments to keep those assets operating at an optimal level over the next 20 years. And so it's going to be very important tonight that you ask the questions from the consulting team here tonight, Mr. Matt Anderson, and get those questions answered tonight. The focus tonight is going to be making sure that if there's data in that report that you have questions about, that you have those questions answered. Tonight's focus will not be what to do with the assets. That will come in the future. And occasionally I may jump in and remind you of that, if that's okay. But the focus will be to make sure that you understand the report. If you have any questions regarding any of these facilities as we walk through them, that you get those questions answered. There's a PowerPoint that will guide the discussion, and I think it's a nice PowerPoint that synthesizes this 800-plus page document that you had the pleasure of working with over the weekend. So with that, I'll introduce Mr. Anderson.
Thank you. And I'm from EMG. I'm a registered architect in California, based in Santa Rosa. And we had a team of people come out to look at the buildings. I want to thank the city staff. They were very helpful in this process. They know the buildings very well. They provided us access to documents and plans and got us into the buildings where we needed to be, and didn't mind if we came back to look at the police department or double check on things, even though it might have been cumbersome for their schedules. So they were very helpful. But overall, as Mark has talked about, we did facility condition assessments and looked at a visual survey of the buildings. We did not take them apart to see what's inside. We didn't look in the walls. We didn't break things. We did talk to people who have done that kind of investigation. But it's really a review of the properties from a visual standpoint and looking at past city records to see what's been fixed, what information they have about what's underground. And it's really a strategic planning tool. It's not saying that these numbers are the budget you have to do this year, but it analyzes each building with the same set of criteria so that you can compare one building to another, and it starts that long-term budgeting process. It can also be useful to city staff to look at immediate needs, and we'll talk later about prioritization and how there's a software platform that's now available to the city to prioritize repairs and to track their completion, and that's one of the reasons they wanted this, not just this report, but it can become a living document in terms of the software that's available online and allows them to track repairs. And if priorities change at the city, then they can rerun the numbers on this database and show how that changes the priorities. There is a list here, as was asked earlier, of the properties that we reviewed. There is a second fire station the city operates but doesn't own, and we did not review that from a condition standpoint. We did. It was just determined that you're not responsible for the repairs, and we wanted to focus on the buildings where you're responsible for their condition. And then, as was pointed out, we looked at not just what the size of the building is or the repair needs, but appraisals were done by Ward Levy Partners that are based in St. Helena. And they have appraisal amounts here. In some cases, like at the buildings are on a larger parcel. The Head Start building is actually at Crane Park, and they didn't appraise the entire Crane Park facility. They took the area that's around that building. The City Hall and Police Station was appraised based on the area of the site around the building, and there's another 3/4 of an acre or so that's Lyman Park that's not part of that City Hall value. So when it says $4.7 million, that's an imaginary parcel around City Hall and the parking lot, but not the Lyman Park facilities. And so then this information, the appraisals, we had a question come up from city staff, and we talked to the appraiser. The teen center and the former CDF building are on the same current parcel. They were appraised separately because there's two buildings. The appraiser's opinion, and they didn't put this in writing other than an email, but the opinion of the appraiser is that if you sold both of those together, the value is about 5% less than what's on this chart. So that it's about $3.2 million. If you combine them together, you could sell one and not the other if a lot split was obtained. And if you did the lot split, that's what you're seeing here is these numbers. If you combine them together, it drops down to about $3,050,000 instead of $3.2 million.
That's in here.
That's in our summary report, yes, but it's not in the individual appraisals. They were asked to appraise each building and the land around it. And then as part of the city staff review, they came back and said, well, what about it's one parcel, not two? How does that affect things? And then this is a chart showing the FCI. And FCI is the Facility Condition Index. It's a national standard for taking the current repair needs divided by the replacement value of the building. And it allows you to take a small building like Scout Hall and compare it to a big building like City Hall and see the relative percentage. So that below 5% is considered good condition. Above 10% is considered poor condition, and above 60 or 65% is where you start to think about demolition instead of trying to repair the building. And those are just general rules that have been determined by the Federal General Services Administration that have been developed and are used throughout the country for evaluating buildings. It doesn't say what the repair cost is, but because it's a percent, it allows you to see them on a relative scale. And this is alphabetical. We could have put the chart from best to worst. The Scout Hall actually comes out worse because of a large crack in the kitchen, which we think relates to the foundation. And then the electrical system is fairly old there, and as soon as you start to fix things in the building, the electrical inspector is going to want you to upgrade the electrical system. So that generates a current need that is working now, but as soon as you start to fix things, people are going to start to want the building to meet current codes, and that's where we think you'll have a problem. But it's fine to operate now. You don't have to bring a building up to current code until you start to renovate it.
So could you repeat
Yes.
very quickly the FCI equation
Yeah.
is the current repair amount divided by the value of the building?
Well, not the value, the replacement cost. And those are not the appraised numbers. In some cases, because of the land cost, the appraised cost is much higher. In some situations where you're in a floodplain, the appraised cost might be lower than the replacement value, just because the land has no value or there's a negative impact from a flood zone. But yeah, those are two different numbers when you look at replacement value, which is reconstructing the building, and the appraised value is what a willing seller would pay to acquire the building, or what you could sell the building for. So in terms of those items, we also looked at 10 and 20-year schedules for what replacements you might come up with based on the condition of current systems and their estimated useful life. And so these current repair charts are identifying things that we saw as problems. And then the 10-year repairs are things that may not be a problem now, but the fire station was built 18, 20 years ago. The mechanical equipment has a 20-year expected useful life, so some of that equipment, or all of that mechanical equipment, will need to be replaced in the next 10 years, or have a significant repair done. So we're projecting cost out based on the current condition and the estimated useful life.
Can I ask a question about
Yes.
some of these
Yeah,
numbers?
please interrupt with questions. Yes.
Or should we hold questions to the end?
Well,
Okay.
no, go ahead. Yes.
So I tried to power through this incredibly long report. It's an impressive volume of stuff. I'm a modeler by nature, so I was trying to pull, I've got this sort of evolving model where I park numbers in there so I can understand them better. So I was trying to pull numbers out of the report, and I got kind of frustrated because there are some inconsistencies, it seems, in the numbers reported in different sections of the report. For example, I'll pick one. The former CDF office building there, the current year repairs are $227,000. That's consistent with the executive summary on page 3 and section 1.4 on page 11. They both have that. If you go down into the detailed facility condition assessment, I think it's page 137, that number drops to $166,000. And I tried to figure out why, and it looks like one includes the markup, one doesn't.
There was a problem with printing, and some of the draft reports we sent don't include that markup.
Okay, and then this version includes an additional item. It's the sprinkler and renovation or something. So it's like there's two different versions. This one was updated since that one was put in there. And then if you go to the next page, the detailed 20-year one, it drops down to, I think, like $138,000 because the location factor wasn't included in the details, even though for most of the buildings it is included. So there's sort of an inconsistency there. And then when I go to, I think it's page 143, there's yet a fourth different total of like $145,000 for the current year repairs. So I just got kind of confused trying to figure out which of the numbers is the latest and greatest number. It seems like the ones at the front of the document have the markup and the location factor included, but I was trying to pull out the 20-year data and throw it into a little spreadsheet, and it's like, okay, well, this one's missing the location factor, and this one's missing...
Right, and we are in the process of fixing that, and again, these are draft reports that we've delivered. The staff is making some comments about other systems, and that's one of the things that we'll fix before the reports are finalized.
Okay.
And there will, again, that's right, this is a draft report, and there will be a final report that takes all that into account and fixes any of those problems.
Okay, and I'm not trying to be critical. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here, and it's easy to kind of get things off a little bit. So I just wanted to clarify, just for my sake, which one is your latest, most current, and I think I know what.
Yeah, and that's why the reports should all have the draft header at the top, and that there will be a whole process to go through for the finals, and you'll have that data updated as we finish the reports.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks.
May I ask a question?
Sorry.
Sure.
The appraisal amount is what it's worth now, but anywhere do you show what it would cost to rebuild the facility?
We have numbers, in fact, this on the screen right now. It says it has the replacement values, what it would cost to rebuild the facility.
So that's what you mean by that?
Yes.
You mean that's if you tore it down?
Well, yes, that was if you tore it down and build a building at the same size in terms of square footage.
Right. But it doesn't help you if you wanted to put a second story on
No,
it.
no, it's
none of that.
no,
You have
it's
to
none
figure
of
that
that,
out along
no.
the way. Is there I noticed in almost all the buildings you've got some of the big costs. In fact, for the Carnegie building, which is in pretty good shape, it seems like one of the things is changing out the windows. They're not double paned, apparently. And is that a generic thing you've done pretty much for all the buildings, just because none of them probably are up to standard?
Not all of the buildings. Where we thought it would make a big difference in terms of either the operating cost or what's there now. So no, it's not a blanket that we applied to every building.
Good, thanks.
And again, there may be some things that we saw at the beginning of December that the staff is already in the process of fixing, or that has been budgeted, and for things that are budgeted or contracted, then before the final reports are issued, we'll take that into account. But again, we want to get your comments before we issue final reports, and so that's what this process is now we're doing. Then, in addition to the facility condition analysis, we tried to look at a space analysis to see which buildings were serving their intended use, where there were problems with lack of space or lack of appropriate space, and look at how many people are in buildings and really how are they being used by the staff and by the public. And to try to identify problems or which buildings are working the best from either serving the public or the staff that uses them. And actually, to go back to that, it does identify the floors and the building areas and the number of staff that we were given by city staff. And as you may already know, the City Hall is the building that has the most problems in terms of city staff and in terms of public using the building. We're not now in City Hall. Most city halls have a room like this where you can have public meetings. Your City Hall had one originally. From our review of the construction plans, 30 or 40 years ago, there was a meeting room where you could have City Hall meetings, and that was expanded into and turned into other uses over time. And then the main fire station is the one that best serves the current use. It's working as a fire station just fine.
So as far as the space analysis goes, I mean, what I've seen throughout, I think, these reports, and I think I have, I mean, you have the building square footage and you have the number of employees that are there, but what I haven't seen, and I was hoping to see, was really what do we need? You know, I know there's some verbiage here and there that says maybe we need 13,000 square feet for City Hall and Police Station or whatever. But I guess, I mean, is that something that you're going to do, is actually provide a space analysis for, and it wouldn't necessarily be for each of these buildings, but it would be, okay, City Hall needs to be 13,000 square feet based on the fact that we have, 39 full-time people there, which I don't know if this 39 includes the police officers and the dispatchers and whatnot, but based on the folks that are there today and allowing for some growth of people, what space should we be looking at for City Hall? And again, take Park and Rec for one. I mean, we have Head Start, we have the Teen Center, we have these bits and pieces of things. Well, I mean, what does the Park and Rec department need? They need space for offices. They need teen centers. They need, adult exercise. We don't have anything that's the city's for, winter sports like basketball and volleyball. And so I guess that's what I'm hoping we would get from a space analysis is what is the city, our size, with our employment characteristics or employee characteristics, and what we've seen from as far as the needs and desires of town. What do we need? Because at the end of the day, we're going to have to sort of make a decision, which is like, okay, so are we going to repair City Hall? Or are we going to tear it down? Well, if we're going to tear it down, do we need 13,000 square feet at $500 a foot? I mean, that's kind of a big deal.
Right. But aren't we jumping ahead?
Well,
no, because he's providing a space analysis. So I'm asking what the space analysis.
But I'm
what
looking
needs
forward
are.
to Tim's little bit by little bit by little bit process, and I assume. I have the same question you have, and on page 35 they do a pretty good analysis of it, but I don't count 39 employees, and I scratch my head when I see 17 executives here. I'm shocked that we have 17 executives. But there's a pretty good analysis of the space that they now have and what they anticipate they're going to need on page 35.
Yeah.
Well, what the scope of the work was, as far as I understand it, was a needs assessment, which was what's the shape of the buildings, what's the repair, and then it included a space analysis. So, the space analysis I'm kind of looking for is, well, what do we need?
Right. Well, and the space analysis has been based on your current uses. It wasn't a programming study to say, do you want to have a facility that's a community center to play basketball in or other indoor, recreational sports for the winter? It was looking at the current facilities and the current uses. So
then, based on the numbers of employees and the information you have here, do these square footages work for the current folks we have? It sounds like not, because just a little bit I've read about Public Works. I think you're suggesting that Public Works needs a lot more office space. So even on that basis, I don't see that we're being given, based on the current employees and the current needs of the current employees, what's the space requirement?
Okay, and earlier you responded or mentioned the 13,000 square feet. That is a number that we came up with from looking at other city halls or city hall buildings with other similar-sized cities, and based on the uses you currently have in that building. We can provide some more data about, like you said, with Public Works again, those buildings don't have enough workstations for the people to produce reports and documentation. The same way the police department has to sit around in an open conference room to do their reports that really should be private or semi-private, and so.
Well, and they only have one holding cell, and
there's
again.
Right. But we looked at it from the standpoint of the offices and the current uses, and we can clarify in terms of going forward square footages. Our understanding was that the city hall or city population was probably not going to be growing very fast, and that you weren't planning for a 10,000 or 15,000 person city, and that the population would be relatively stable.
Can I just ask one
Sure.
very specific question on for the current replacement value for the city hall facility? It just says metric. What is that on page 7?
That would be the replacement value would be the current square footage times
So it's just the formula.
It's just a formula, yes, and that's used to compare the repair needs to the current value. But as far as the space analysis, yes, we did look at some of the recreational facilities and the teen center. Having 3 separate buildings is not efficient. You can't get from the office to the game room without going outside. And so staff doesn't have quick access to kids or maybe know what's going on, because they're in separate buildings.
Can I just say that I think this is an amazing report. You've got a lot of information here, an enormous amount of information here. But what becomes very clear very quickly is that there are 1,000 ways to skin this cat. And so I can understand why you're flummoxed about how do we determine those things. And it seems to me that's another step down the line, as Tim was saying, that we're going to have to figure that out.
We'll talk a little bit.
That we're just going to replace that building. It may be that we replace it with 3 different buildings that already exist, and maybe you'll tear it down. So you've given us quite a lot of information there. Not all, but a lot.
Right, but from overall, we found the recreation buildings are serving their function, although, as you said, there's no winter sports like basketball that are indoors. The Head Start building is utilized in the summer, but not in the winter, so there's an underutilization of that building. It also has restrooms that face the Crane Park that were originally supposed to be used by people in Crane Park. They're now closed off from the outside. Nobody uses them, and they're not accessible from the inside. And you'd have the opportunity to use those restrooms as part of the interior of the building. That might allow for different uses. It would certainly be better for the staff because they have very small children restrooms, but no staff restrooms.
But one of the things I didn't see in your report was the utilization of various buildings. For instance, how many teens use the teen center, how many days a week? And I think that's something that bears a lot of discussion. But again, I think it's jumping ahead. So we have to decide, are we going to discuss this kind of thing now or are we not? But you mentioned nothing at all about the utilization of the teen center.
Yeah, and I don't know if there is any staff data on how many teens use it on a daily basis.
They told me that it was an average of 13 kids, middle schoolers, that's it. Totally underutilized facility. Okay. And the Head Start is for 2 months in the summer only, and for only a couple hours a day. So it's utterly underutilized as well.
Right. Yes. I wasn't aware of that 13 number, but that is another reason it could be low is because it's set up into 3 different buildings, and there's just older structures, and it's been converted into that use, not designed for that use.
Right.
I had a question on the teen center. You had said that it could be over in the Head Start building, but it couldn't be because it needs to be close to downtown.
That was our opinion. But again, the city and talking to the residents may have a different opinion. But as you said, if it's middle schoolers and it's that far out at Crane Park, that could be too far where parents don't want their kids going that far, and they might be more comfortable with them in a more downtown location. But again, we're not making decisions. We're just putting out either opinions or options or directions to review.
But if we are going to continue to discuss this, we were told that the Boys and Girls Club actually has space for the teens, but one of the staff members said, well, the teens don't like to walk through the little kids to get to their space that they have to use. So the point is, there are other buildings in town that probably aren't fully utilized, and I certainly think we should look at that.
Yeah, and again, that's what you talked about with next steps and further discussion is, do you move the teen center into what's now the CDF, or what was the CDF building? That might serve that need better, but again, you'd have to go through a process of talking to the staff and the teens or the parents and see what makes the most sense. But for now, we'll be able to give you condition, and you can then look at that during a later process about what uses might move between buildings. And but this gives you the basic assumption that that former CDF building is about 1,000 square feet bigger than the current teen center, which would allow you to do more programs or more things that might get more people to use the building. And the same thing with the teen center and the former CDF building, with it being one parcel, you could split that off, or the city council could split that off into two parcels and sell one and keep the other, or sell both, or combine them. There are some options there, and that's something that the committee or the council need to consider is, do you want to split that into two parcels or not? And the appraisals are based on two buildings, so we gave you two numbers. But right now, they're one parcel. And then we noted that there's some public work functions that might move towards the wastewater treatment area, depending on the land use and the availability of space there.
Does that, I'm not sure I understand, does that mean that everything that is at the corporation yard right now could be accommodated there, or are you splitting what's going on at the corp yard into different
Well,
pieces?
from talking to city staff, they don't want to split the people in the corporation yard, because that's where the trucks are parked, that's where materials are stored. They want to keep those uses together, but there is the possibility, and again, there need to be a further study to see, could all those uses be moved to the water treatment plant, depending on how much land and what the planning setbacks are.
Okay, but theoretically, right now, it's a possibility, you just don't.
Yeah, it's
Don't know yet.
right.
Okay.
And we had talked about perhaps moving the Public Works staff members somewhere else and leaving the corporation yard with storage, and city staff is saying that's not very workable from their standpoint, because people, the Public Works employees, would come in the morning, get their assignments, get their truck, get their materials, and go somewhere, and they don't want to be driving between their office and that warehouse and then back. It just would use up more city time. But one of the options that you'll have is something called swing space, and that's used where if you want to renovate a building or change its use, the Carnegie building looks like it would be great for swing space. You could move certain activities into that building on a 6-month basis while you renovate something else. And then, because that building right now appears to be underutilized, or you could move uses around and create that as a swing space. It's a very nice old building. It has square footage that you can use that could be used for that condition. And so that's something to consider. If you're going to move a use or renovate a building, you could move that current use into that building on a temporary basis.
I saw that comment in a few different places. Mm-hmm. So, but then where do the activities go that are happening at Carnegie Building or other,
Well, again, that's the planning part of it, where you might, as you said, some of the other buildings are underutilized, and maybe they temporarily have to move out of that space, or they all are upstairs, and then downstairs you have additional offices or that swing space constructed. So it's more of an optional. Some cities have no extra space or no option for doing that, and it becomes difficult to renovate a building because the people in the building have to go somewhere. You do have the option of some buildings like the Carnegie building that could take in a temporary use.
we could just move them all into La Condesa and they could just use it, right?
Can I ask you how you came up with the amount to rebuild or build a new city hall, 10,000 square feet? I think it was like 3.2 million.
3.133.
I don't have the numbers
That's looking at standard construction indices that are published by national agencies and what we've been seeing in terms of the construction costs. It is the basic building cost. It does not include city staff time to manage it. It doesn't include interest. It doesn't include things like that would be more from a financing standpoint. It's just a sort of a raw building cost.
But if I'm looking at this correctly, you're using $285 a square foot, and residential's gone up to $500 a square foot. So this number could be drastically lower than realistically it is now.
Well, again, that's based on the current conditions, and residential construction costs tend to be higher than commercial because you're dealing with a small space with a lot of expensive finishes, and with the city hall building, though the finishes may be expensive, it's larger spaces. You don't have a lot of small 10-foot square rooms or 12-foot square the way you might have in a bedroom.
However, since we got on the subject of building costs and throughout, the repair costs and whatnot, I guess I do want to understand a little bit more about that and the cost estimates that you're using for repairs, because I did look at a number of those, and you can look at those at least based on the experience I've had, and I think the opinion of probable costs said based on invoices, bid documents, construction costs developed by R.S. Means and Marshall and Swift, EMG, something on similar properties and city indexes and assumptions regarding future economic conditions. So I guess I'm a little bit curious about that. I don't think you've actually gotten the invoices or bid costs because we haven't done that.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
At least not from your city.
I'm not. Where's R.S. Means and Marshall and Swift? Where do they operate?
They operate nationwide, and when we talked about earlier about location factors, they'll have a basic United States cost, and then for St. Helena, that's actually 21% higher, because your costs are higher than the rest of the country by that amount.
And how did that index develop? Is that an index that's really, because if you take Napa County and you look at costs associated with buildings and whatnot in Napa County, most of that stuff's really happening in, Napa and American Canyon, and I think that you're going to find that it's a little bit less expensive to build an office building or to replace certain items, whether it's windows or roofs or whatever, down there than it is up here. So I'm a little bit, and like Tim said, this is a massive amount of information. I just want to make sure we're going into these replacement costs or the repair costs with our eyes wide open, because it does concern me. I have experience every month with this stuff, with fixing buildings and building buildings and whatnot, and I looked at very specific instances of repairs, and they just looked incredibly low to me. And so if you're saying 21%, and I don't know, are they using a county and then they're adding 21% to it? Because that could really be maybe 50%.
It's based on the RS Means uses it, as you said, by county. So that would really be the Napa County. Were they tested at all? Did we go out to anybody and say, hey, so here's some items we've got, what are you going to come up with? I saw windows being replaced at, I think, $750 a window. Impossible in St. Helena. It's not going to happen. It's probably $2,000 a window. I from my own experience and from what checks I've written. So, and then I guess the other issue along that is also then economic conditions, and I don't know what economic conditions you've considered, but I think right now we're economically or trades-wise, we're in a pretty bad place, because with the recent fires and all the trades that are going to be going and doing stuff in Sonoma and in Napa, we're lacking trade. And if we wanted to get somebody in here to do some significant repairs, I think we're going to be paying through the nose. And
so I really do worry about the costs.
And we can take a look at that. It does not include, as you said, the conditions of Santa Rosa having fire damage and all the workers being over there and not here. But that is something we can add a factor to. The individual costs have been assessed or checked with various other contractors that we work with, or we do a lot of work with retail stores and shopping centers where we're doing costs and improvements to those. in terms of the renovations themselves, it's all based on a per item cost. So if you're going to have a general contractor go through and do everything at once, we haven't included the general contractor fees. It's, at this point, an individual replacing a cooling unit, replacing a roof. It's the cost to do that work individually. If you decide to hire a general contractor and do everything at once, there would be general contractor fees and in addition to city costs, and those are not included in these estimates.
I would just, I mean, we've said this is the draft report, and boy, those repair costs and major improvements in HVAC units, I would take a really hard look at those numbers. We do not want to understate what those are, and just, I mean, it's off the, just sort of ballparking it, I think they're 50% higher than the numbers we have right now in front of us.
Okay. Well,
I just, that's my...
Well, yeah, can I jump in? 2 years ago, I just took it upon myself as just a mental exercise to see what it would cost to replace City Hall. So I was trying to find somebody who could give me an estimate, and, you know, everybody was blowing me off because it's like, yeah, right, we're going to give you an estimate for City Hall. Are you writing the check? I go, no, but I'm just curious. But I found one company called Lusardi Construction. They're down in the Bay Area. And they were kind enough to say, okay, send us the requirements. So I said 10,000 square feet. It's next to Lyman Park. You know, it's Napa Valley, like what Mark said. You know, it's high cost. And they said, well, any government construction is going to be another 20% because of this labor issue. I don't know what the buzzword is for that, but that didn't sound good. So I said, so what's the numbers? And he goes, okay. So they emailed me about 2 weeks later, and they said it's $450 a foot for the shell, $1 million for the site work, and $1 million for the soft costs. So that's $6.5 million before the tenant improvements.
Right, but you're talking about building a new building. I'm talking about
Well, I thought that was what it
repair
was.
costs that he's...
No, but he's talking about replacement.
Well, there's both
Well, but I'm-
discussions. There's replacement in full of the replacement value, and then there's the individual heating units, cooling units, things like that.
No, but I was trying to
I
get
wasn't
to...
referring to replacement costs.
No, I know you weren't, but I was just trying to get to what does it cost to build a new city hall? I just wanted to know.
Yeah.
And the numbers I got 2 years ago was $6.5 million.
Probably
And
not wrong.
Lusardi, they build high schools, civic centers, they build all the big stuff, so they're not local construction guys that are taking a guess. So, I mean, I think we need these kind of numbers to kind of really look at also, because if I see 3.1 million, I don't know if we're going to make the right decision based on that. It's more like double that. You know how it goes in constructions. You know, you always get the bid, and it's always 50%, 100% more.
Well, I think
Yeah,
when
no, I
we,
understand.
Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when we get to some other consultants that we're going to be using, they're going to be helping us develop what it would cost to build something new.
Yes, and the chair is referring to Cosmont Companies, which we have scheduled to come on February 7th to the committee to talk about asset strategy, which is really how to pay for things, how to finance things, how other cities have confronted with the same challenge, dealt with these types of issues. And in the context of that, that firm also would have expertise in cost. And I think it's, the conversation tonight is a fair conversation because this is a review of a draft document, and I think there are other factors that have been referenced that can be applied to this. But the conversation is a good one because it reminds us that we need to, there's two things. One, we're never going to be able to identify to the true dollar what that cost is. This is really a bit of an order of magnitude exercise, but we do want to try to be as accurate as possible.
Well, and the repair costs are going to be important, right? Because we need to know if we went down this road of like, okay, it's going to be a comparison of, well, to repair City Hall and the police station is going to cost X, and to build a new one is going to cost Y. I mean, and then when you look at the repair and maintenance of a new City Hall versus continue. I mean, so we do need to have pretty good numbers for both of those.
Right, and the other thing to keep in mind with public buildings, particularly a city hall type building, is there is prevailing wage, which I think is the reference that you were referring to.
Prevailing wage, that's it.
Right. And then in addition to that, city hall facilities and police facilities, city hall and police facilities are considered essential services facilities. They operate under a different building code. There are higher standards for those facilities, which tends to drive the cost of those facilities up.
Right. And to answer one of your other questions about, in our reports where it talks about economic conditions, when we do a 10-year or 20-year estimate, we include inflation. In terms of every year, there's an increase in cost. And right now, the tables have been prepared with 3% yearly assumption for inflation. The state of California has asked us to use 4%. Some other agencies are 2.5%. And so it can be adjusted in the software. If you want to plan for a higher inflation rate, that can be changed very quickly. And so that's one other thing to keep in mind, that we've given you an industry standard, but some agencies go more conservative and increase that inflation cost.
Well, I think that's a discussion to definitely have with staff and maybe take some of what we're saying. And economic conditions are more than just whatever the inflation rate is. It's supply versus demand.
Right.
I mean, so.
Yeah, and your consultant may be able to give us a better idea of whether we should be using 4% or 3 or 5. And again, that's a decision that can be changed quickly within the software.
Well, and before it's finalized, I mean, we could go out, right, and ask for some bids from some people on some of these larger items just to give it a sanity test to see if we're remotely close.
Well, another approach could be a peer review of sorts through Cosmont Companies, which is under contract today with the city and has a flexible scope of work. So that is something that we can work on and consider.
Okay, so given that discussion about costs, we wanted to present some of the costs the costs we've identified, and in some cases we've only used the 10 most expensive for this discussion, just to give you an idea of the types of problems that we're identifying. And if you have time, I wanted to go through those quickly for each building. Again, the Carnegie building, we're seeing some problems with storm drainage, that they get water in the basement on certain storm conditions, and that's going to need to be reviewed. As we talked about earlier, we were recommending some improvements to windows that's mostly for the standpoint of improving the comfort of the people inside the building and reducing the energy usage.
Did they find the cause of that water? Because that's apparently what's led to the mold and what's destroyed the elevator, and they still don't know what's causing it, so they therefore haven't repaired those things?
Correct.
Is that where we are at this point?
That's where we are at this point, yes.
And you don't have the cost of repairing the elevator in here, and I understand it's going to be considerable.
Okay, I would have to go back and check with our staff that looked at that. I don't know if they had planned on replacing the elevator after the work, or if it's just a matter of sealing the leak and then cleaning up the rust in the. But we can check on that.
Yeah, there was a comment in there that I guess said, I mean, because you didn't say the elevator wasn't working, because what I read, if I remember correctly, was that city staff that was there, who has Public Works, noted the repair that needed to be made, and they were going to do it. Did we repair the elevator?
It's not repaired yet, but there is a need to align 3 different service providers, so it's a bit of making sure that the planets align. So we have a software vendor, we have a customized elevator which contributes to this, and so it's the manufacturer, it's the software, and one other vendor, and getting them all to coordinate and show up at the same time. So that's where we're at today.
I think it's been lingering for a long time, and that's one of the reasons it's not ADA compliant, and it can't be used, and it's a therefore underutilized building. So these are the ongoing issues that we're struggling with here.
Right. But at least to answer your question, no, at this point it hasn't been determined directly where the water's coming from, but we are recommending that the city continue to investigate that process. And at the City Hall, there's a long list of problems that I'm sure you're all aware of. The roof is the most significant one. Because of there have been leaks. It is an old system. They put a foam roof over the original flat roof that's a built-up roof. And that will be a significant cost to replace. There are some other, the electrical system that they've had problems with electrical there. In some cases, some of the switchgear is the original 1950s switchgear. And so we've identified a number of problems there. Things are being put, working with the current staff. They're keeping things operating, but they're having to replace things piecemeal when something breaks. or if they can't get spare parts for some of the older equipment. And this is what contributes to some of the problems at City Hall, and we were recommending some of the replacement of the HVAC equipment just because it's becoming difficult to operate. It still works, most of it, but it's becoming more of a maintenance problem where they're spending a lot of time repairing it, and it's at that point becomes a better decision to replace it rather than to continually repair it. And the newer equipment is more energy efficient than some of the early 1990s equipment that's up there now. And there are problems with the exterior overhangs are very large on that building, part of the 1950s design. On the back of the building, there's temporary posts holding it up in one place because it's deteriorated from moisture getting in. Some other areas we're seeing moisture damage on the outside of the gutters, and there's probably more moisture damage inside that we can't see. Let's see. In terms of the fire station, there are some minor things going on that at this time, but generally it's the building. From an overall standpoint, the size of the building compared to some of the cost, it's in the best system or the best condition. There is some HVAC equipment that has a lot of rust in the upstairs areas that needs to be cleaned up, and that could be, from a maintenance standpoint, that could be done fairly easily. The CDF building, or what was the CDF building, and I guess now is vacant, there are a number of things that need to be done there relating to interior finishes. And there are, if you start to reconstruct that building, you're most likely going to have to fire sprinkle and fire alarm the building, so that if your consideration is to put city staff in there or change the use, then the building department is going to want some additional life safety expenses. And so you start out with a smaller expense and it starts growing because of the additional for fire alarm and fire sprinklers.
Can I
sure.
Ask a quick question?
Yeah.
This is more of a housekeeping issue. Just if you go back to the prior slide, it's difficult for me, I don't know if I'm the only one, when you read across, to tell exactly what items go with which, and if you go back even one more slide, okay, that one has the lines that tell, okay, this all goes together, that all goes together. On the prior slides, it talked about things, and it was unclear as to whether or not the pedestrian pavement, sidewalk, masonry, pavers replaced go with the walkway to the street or the basement intrusion. So if you could just have some lines in there that separate things that
like
make it,
yes,
yeah, that'd be
okay.
Thanks. Yeah. It would make it easier to read. Thanks.
Okay. Yes, we can do that. That's.
Thank you. It's driving me crazy.
Yeah, and again, we have the lines on some of them and not on others. So, in terms of the Head Start building, there are repair needs at that building also. It has problems with plumbing. It needs a new roof. So again, these lists are in the reports, and this is what later on we'll talk about prioritization, but these are what goes into the FCI that we talked about in terms of current year repairs. At Lyman Park, there is an issue that we see coming up a number of places where the city has installed a paver system for the sidewalks, and then the tree roots have turned it into like an ocean scene where it slopes up and down. And so in these cases, even though it may be city property in terms of the street right-of-way, we've put those costs in with the buildings or with the park. So with City Hall, you're seeing replacing some pavers. With Lyman Park, you're seeing replacing those. A private developer might come back to the city and say, it's your problem, not the problem of the buildings. But since these are city buildings, we included those costs with the buildings.
But I was wondering about that because it's my understanding that the city got, Vice Mayor Peter White was able to obtain some grant money for fixing the city's sidewalks. And so I was wondering why that cost is in here when the city's getting money to fix the sidewalks.
Well, as a general rule, if money is contracted to someone, we've left it out of the budget. If there's a budget or a fund, but it hasn't been contracted, we've left it in. So our understanding is,
Go out.
yes, it could go out, or it could come from a different pot of money and not from these repairs. And that's why I was mentioning it, because there may be.
I think the repair cost is still there. It's just how it's funded.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's funded out of general fund.
Well, or it comes from a grant, or it comes from borrowing money.
That's what I'm saying. There was a grant already awarded.
Yeah, but I don't think the money comes for a year and a half.
Committee Member Dell is correct. We do have a grant. It's a $1.2 million grant, and it is intended to assist with sidewalk repairs, essentially from the bridge at the creek all the way to City Hall, both sides of the road. The challenge will be, it would be appropriate to replace sewer and water laterals at the same time, deal with street tree conflicts, which are causing problems with buildings as well as the sidewalks and other infrastructure. And so it's a very comprehensive project. It will likely require additional city money on top of that grant. But certainly this area that we're talking about, the sidewalk adjacent to the park, is part of that project.
Mm-hmm. And so at some point from this estimate here, that money may go to a different budget, but we've identified it separately so that the city can track that and how that's spent.
So I had a question, because we looked at some repairs for Lyman Park, but we didn't look at any repairs at any other parks, like Crane Park bathrooms and the Bocce building, and I mean, so somehow we just looked at Lyman Park, but we didn't look at anything else. Did we specifically just decide to not?
The focus is really on buildings, but because Lyman Park is adjacent to City Hall, and City Hall is essentially in play as an option for different possibilities, we felt it would be appropriate to include this. I will also note for the record that one of the council's goals this year and objectives is for us to work on a Lyman Park renovation strategy. And so we will soon be working to introduce a community engagement process by which the community will participate in a future design of or refresh of that park, and following that, an identification of the cost of those improvements, and then eventually a funding strategy, with a possibility of actually beginning that project as early as next year. So that is something that's going to be worked on very quickly and will be happening from a community engagement standpoint, we anticipate over the summer this year.
Are there restrictions on what that land can be used for?
There are restrictions related to that property. It needs to be used as a park, and I believe described as a passive park.
How about the Scout Hall? I know, Suzanne, you said something about the person who donated Scout Hall indicated it always had to be a Scout Hall.
Well, at the time she donated it, but
is that still true?
So I don't have the answer to that question at the moment, but we are investing some resources in looking at title searches for a number of the properties, and this is one of those. The Scout Hall is one that we will take a look at, because I know the committee will have questions about any restrictions on some of these sites, and so we have someone that's looking at that now.
Is Carnegie's on that list, I assume?
Carnegie is likely on that list, yes.
I guess we would, if you're going to do title search, you're going to do title search on all of them and make sure there's no restrictions on any of them, right?
Essentially, I think we know the answer to some of these, and in others, Signorelli Barn, I'm not sure that we necessarily put that one on the list. I'll have to double check.
Okay. And you mentioned City Hall and Lyman Park, but I think City Hall is part of the parcel that's with the fire department, right? City Hall is not part of a parcel with Lyman Park.
I believe it's a separate parcel from Lyman Park. I don't know if it's the same parcel as the fire department.
Those are different parcels. Our understanding is that from a legal standpoint, Pine Street continues past the fire station in what looks like a parking lot, but is legally a public street. And that actually contributes to some of the problems from a space analysis and building use. And one of our next steps is to consider realigning or revising what's Pine Street now, because it doesn't really make any sense to go through the parking lot that's on the south side of the fire station as a public street. I mean, it looks like it's parking for the fire department because it's next to the building, but I think legally it's public parking, and anybody can park there. And there have been some complaints about emergency vehicle access, because if the police and fire are both going to the same event at the same time, they're using the same driveway to come out of. And that's one of them has to wait for the other, or they have to coordinate who gets out first. And so that there are some opportunities there to fix that problem. And we were also told that the City Hall and Lyman Park is one parcel and the fire station is the other parcel. That's what the appraiser determined.
I don't think that's how your report reads. I think at least one place in the report I read that it was part of the fire station property. Because I actually had that question, and then I read somewhere in your report that it was associated with that in one of the I think in the appraisal.
Okay, well, I will check that. I thought the appraisal had Lyman Park and City Hall in the same parcel. It's a 1.7 acre parcel, and we can check the city parcel maps to see how that is working. But some of the flexibility for future design would be improved if there wasn't a public right-of-way from Main Street to Railroad Avenue. And I don't think right now people don't use it that way because they see the fire department and they stop and turn around. But from a legal standpoint, you can't use that property except as a public street.
I'd check it.
And then the
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Can I just come back to the idea of are we ever going to know what it really costs to build a new city hall? I think that's what I'd like to get at, because I'm just applying like a layman's attitude, like buying a home, right? Mm-hmm. There's a kind of a rundown home. It's really ugly. It's got a lot of repairs. And you say to yourself, okay, I can keep fixing it up, even though it's not big enough for my family. Or I can buy a new home and I can finance it. And so I want to compare that cash flow, what it takes to own a new home that'll be accommodating to all the members of my family, versus some rundown shack that's always going to have problems, that's never going to be big enough for my family. And I can make that comparison when I go buy a home, but I'd like to apply that same metaphor to, City Hall, because I see these huge repairs and you're thinking that's only going to bring back what this ugly building is, but, sealed up.
Right.
It's still not, your report said it's not big enough to accommodate the staff. Mm-hmm. And so it's like there's nowhere to go with this. There's no end game here.
Well, but I think that's with not just our work, but with the other financial consultant, that they'll be getting more information about type of those options.
But in other words, real numbers, like what's it going to cost to build 13,000 square feet, or right?
We had in working with EMG, one of the questions was, do we anticipate any growth in the staff? And my answer was, not really. I mean, I can see incremental, small changes over time, but I really don't see much change in the staff growth, which is good because it gives us some certainty in terms of the scale or size of a building. And part of the work that was done was to take a look at some other cities of similar size with similar numbers of staff, modern buildings. I think one of the observations of City Hall is that it's just not the current configuration. It doesn't utilize space in a smart way. And so we have walls that are former fire apparatus bays that contribute to the configuration of the current use of the building, other design characteristics that just contribute to challenges in communication, service delivery, et cetera. So the space in the building isn't optimized as it would be in a modern building. And so the 10,000 odd square feet that we're using today, the optimal design right now that we're looking at is a $13,000 based on this analysis, 13,000 square feet. And it's just a matter of figuring out what the appropriate construction cost is, for a modern essential services building in Napa County, and putting that number to the 13,000 square feet. I don't know that we would need to necessarily design higher than that, and I don't recall if that included a council chambers.
It includes a small council chambers at the size of this room, but no bigger than that, yeah.
Which could be a multi-purpose room. I mean, one of the shortcomings of the City Hall is that we don't have a council chambers, which also can serve as a community facility when it's not in use a couple of hours every month for public meetings. It can certainly be available for training, community meetings, etc. And those are nice amenities to have with a city hall. But that's included in the 13,000. That probably
Yes.
contributed to the growth, because we really, in our conversations, didn't anticipate a need for much more space than we
Right.
have today. It's just how we allocate that space. I suggested we needed at least one additional conference room besides the one that we have, since when we have second meetings, they're in the closet where we store records, and that's just not optimal.
It just seems to me that we're a little premature with all of this. I mean, there are so many ways to skin this cat. It's almost 11,000 square feet. If you put a second story on it, the building next to it on its right side when you're facing it is a two-story building. There's no reason not to put another floor on that. And then you had 21,000 square feet. You could put the Historical Society, you could put all the rec people, you could put everything that's in town in one big building and still have room for this. So we just have to figure out what's the best way to do that, put it on another parcel, put it on that parcel, but I think we're premature with
Yeah, a lot of those.
these
Okay,
conversations.
but Oliver asked the question, he wants to know what's it going to cost to build a new city hall. That's not what we're doing here today. We're talking about repair, appraisals, replacement. That's going to come later.
Right, exactly.
Right. So we identified your problems at the Public Works buildings that you're all aware of, that you've talked about. One of the observations we would make is that although these may be the cost to fix the problems, a lot of them are portable structures, and it's usually easier to replace it than try to repair it because of the age that the portable structures are. It's more expensive to work on portable structures. And if you did a new portable structure, you'd have the opportunity to configure it the way you wanted it to, or you could make the decision to not do portables at all and put in, permanent buildings.
It was, can I just add,
Yeah.
it was unclear in the report, and it was unclear when I was standing out there, what's the cause of the massive flooding that they've had every few years? Is that stream bed?
Yeah,
And if it's the stream bed,
Sulphur Creek.
what could
Yeah.
we possibly do to change that? And if you're going to put in all new buildings there, what's the idea about how you're going to change the direction of that stream bed that floods it every few
Well,
years?
No, what you do is you do
Probably 20 million.
infill. You pull everything out of there, you infill, and you raise the thing up. That's exactly
It's
what
still
a
gonna-
developer would do. Is if you ended up selling that property,
Right.
that's what they would do. They would bring in and add 2 or 3 feet of fill and bring the level up.
But
you
then-
wouldn't do anything with the stream bed.
Right, so where does the flooding from Sulphur Spring go if you're going to do that? It's just around it?
Well,
So we have the same problem. So this seems like a bad place to put in new equipment.
But all
this is
those
another thing
buildings
to
down
think
there, all those rusted out vehicles that are sitting down there, they all get flooded out, right?
Right. So is there enough property over by the water?
Well, we didn't analyze the water plant. The city staff thinks that there probably is, but there has not been a detailed analysis of that to see if you could move it all to that site. It's been discussed, and again, that would be one of the next steps to look at. Is there some other city property that could be used instead of that one?
Great.
Yes, again, from a flood zone standpoint, there's a FEMA process doing a letter of map amendment where you can do either stream improvements or raise the land up, but it's a fairly long process, and you have to make sure you're not impacting negatively other property owners, and it takes years to do that.
Right.
So, in terms of Scout Hall, as I said earlier, the main things we were seeing is that there is a crack in the floor in the kitchen that goes all the way through the slab, and it's not a small crack, and it's an offset, and it should be dealt with from a foundation standpoint. And then the electrical system is older, so that once those two problems are fixed, then there's not as much wrong with that building.
Was that donated to the city for the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts specifically? So do they pay rent? Or is this was a gift to them that the city maintains?
They don't pay rent, but I'm not sure of the answer to the other question.
Because it seems to me that building is way underutilized too, and if it were repaired to some degree, that would be some good meeting spaces,
Right.
dance classes, and some of the things that we're spreading out in other buildings.
Well, we're going to look at the restrictions on that property, because everything I've ever heard in the little bit of time I've lived here is it's for Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, and that's it. The question I had was, who's responsible for repairs of the building?
Yeah, I have that same question.
Yeah.
I mean, if it can only be used for Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, are we responsible for the repairs of the building?
Right.
It's my understanding the city is responsible and has invested resources in the past for the maintenance of the building.
Yeah, and
So again, that's the same thing that we should maybe find out when we look at these deed restrictions and stuff.
Right.
And okay.
Yeah, and from the standpoint of using it for other uses, there's no wheelchair access to the second floor. So that's right now just storage. It's not a public use. If it's going to be made into a public use, you'll need to put an elevator into the building, or on the outside, or some solution, and that would be expensive and difficult in that building.
But it could be potentially rented for private events, private parties, anything, if we didn't have deed restrictions that might help pay for the maintenance of the building?
Yeah, if it's, again, from that standpoint, yes. Once the deed restrictions or the use of the building, just from a purely structural standpoint, yes, once you've repaired the floor crack and some other repairs, then yes, it could be rented out. The same with the Signorelli barn, that there's been discussion about should that continue to be used as storage, should it be turned into a more tourist-oriented use. We noted a couple things about the building, that it's on a curve. Periodically, cars lose control and hit the building. We would recommend doing a phased approach to that building and putting in a low stone wall that's historical in nature that would stop cars from hitting the building. You could use it as a shade structure now for events, with just doing a structural review and the foundations and making sure the building is structurally safe. Or you could do, improvements on a phased basis depending on what's allowed. Again, that property is close to residential use. There may be limits on what you can do at the building. If you convert it to some other, use, the things that are stored in that building have to go somewhere.
But they're all junk?
You're looking into the covenant on that building as well, what can be done. Is that the original site of that building, or was that moved there? That's the original site? And could it be dismantled and moved to someplace else in town? We don't know. Well, we might want to take it.
That'd be like trying to move the 76 station that was at Adams Street.
Well, yeah,
Main Street, that thing's
no
going to
gas
fall
tanks
apart
underneath
as soon
it, though,
as you try to move it.
It's practically falling down, but it's a beautiful exterior shell that might add itself to a really nice site someplace else for city use.
Right. Well, that's, again, it has some options, but it needs to be protected from cars hitting it,
Right.
and then it would need a structural review before it had any public use.
And is that part of a park, that property? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that
It's a
property...
single parcel, right? I think it's a single parcel attached to Miley Park.
Yeah.
But it could be sold if you took that barn someplace else and used it?
Well, again,
Potentially.
there is an appraised value to the property.
600 and
Yes.
something thousand?
Yes. It's not as high as some of the other parcels, but there is a value to that. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
And then the library has some problem. It has some problems. They did a structural review in addition to our report just last week, and some of that review is still pending about whether a crack in the building is a substantial problem or a minor problem, or what the repair is for that. So as that information is finalized, we'll incorporate that into the reports. So this cost could go up or down significantly depending on what the engineer has found.
The elevator there doesn't work either.
Yeah, no, I don't.
That's not in your report, but it doesn't work.
Okay.
While he's typing that, can I just ask, do you know, the city still owns the parking lot just down from the Carnegie Building? Don't we have like 17 slots there, or a number of slots? Is that where the new $300,000 restroom is going to go?
This is the Oak Avenue parking lot?
Yeah.
Yes, we own that parking lot.
And then, as we discussed, the teen center also has some repair needs, and that's a smaller building, or three small buildings on a single parcel, and there's some discussion about, do you repair it, do you move the use, and those are some of the discussions that would go on at a later date. These are to bring it up, these repairs are to bring it up into a good condition building. And then one of the other things that we wanted to talk about is just what data is available to you. And because we've put costs into a database, it's able to be sorted in different ways. Rather than looking at what the repair needs are on a building, this is looking at the entire city over 10 years. And rather than looking at individual buildings, it's looking at systems. So how much do you need to spend on roofing or on foundations or on accessibility work, so that information can be presented from a couple of different standpoints. And staff has access to the database so they can run reports and get additional documentation. So this is why the database can become sort of a living document, and you can look at what money is proposed to be spent in different ways. So that's just one of the features of a database that this cost information has been put into. We also have, from a 20-year standpoint, this is looking at some of the expenses. One of the surprises to us was the fire station. Cost is fairly high. Because it's 20 years old, there are a lot of systems that wear out in the 20 to 25-year range. So that while it hasn't been a big cost to the city in the last 20 years, it's going to be a cost in the next 20, because you'll be replacing the heating and cooling systems. There's a lot of finishes that will need replacing, light fixtures, things like that. So it's something that the city has to budget for over this time period. Not that it's a current need, but you want to start budgeting money for that in your planning for future budgets.
What on earth are you going to replace in the Signorelli barn? The dirt floor or what?
Well, no, that would be if the roof is one thing. The roof is aging. It's a corrugated tin type roof, and so that replacement is mostly the roof and some of the siding. You can see through the siding right now, so that needs to have. And this does include the current repairs too.
Can you back up one slide?
Sure.
So there's some pretty substantial year-to-year variations on that. How solid are some of the timing elements in here? I mean, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing, $7 million, but could you more or less treat this as $7 million that has to be spent over 10 years? And if you were able to, aside from the current year repairs, if you were able to divide that by 10, could it be spread out? Or
Yes.
are the timing elements here pretty urgently needed in exactly 3 years?
No, the further out you go, the less accurate they are, because we don't know what maintenance is going to have. We don't know, what the city budgets will be in the future. But to answer your basic question, yes, you could take the total, divide it by 10 years, and spend that money each year. And there are ways in the database, from a budgeting standpoint, to move things from year to year. The city staff can go in and say, well, we're not going to do that this year. We'll move it to next year. Or we're going to do all the roofs at the same time to get one contractor and get a volume discount. So we'll move some things up into this year because we want to do all the roofs at the same time. So it's an estimate on our part based on the current condition, and the expected useful life for something like a built-up roof is 20 years. The air conditioning units are 15. So we take that into account and make estimates. And, the 2018 and 2019 are pretty accurate. 26 and 27 are an estimate in terms of 2026, so that it's an estimate on our part based on current management practices. And it doesn't take into account whatever technology is invented 10 years from now, and there may be a different control system, or there may be robots that install things. It doesn't take into account any of that, things that might change. And then this is more of, there is an individual reserve table for each building that lists not just the current repairs, but repairs over the next 20 years. And we've taken the ADA transition plan that the city has already established and put those dollars in here in the years where that's been programmed in as part of the transition plan, so that city staff can go through these individual tables. They were in the reports that you were given, and you can see what is coming up soon, what might be a cost 15 years from now, but it gives you information for future planning. And because in some cases, if you're considering changing the use of a building, or disposing of a building, or that will give you an idea about not what the current cost is, but what the future cost would be. And then we also have a prioritization function where we've looked at the costs that are in the entire report for the whole city. They're given numerical scores for how long the estimated useful life is, whether it's a fire system or a carpeting system or planting on the outside of the building. And that system is based on also the the facilities. We went through with city staff and gave a preliminary building ranking system in terms of which buildings are more important than others. So City Hall might be more important than the teen center. And this generates a score from 1 to 100 and a ranking for each of those items so that city staff can see, compared to everything, what would the recommendation be for replacement. And we worked with city staff on what the building rankings would be, and fire and life safety systems are a higher ranking than, say, lighting might be, and landscaping is at the lowest rating. But that also can be changed in the database as you go forward. If you decide that a certain building is being taken out of the equation, you can drop that building out and not, if you don't want to assess the Head Start building because you're going to, have it just be Crane Park and not part of this analysis, it could drop out. So it's again a way of this database being more of a living document that you can adjust the prioritization as needed, or as you complete things. They can be taken out of that system. And these are all exportable in Excel so that you can do cost estimates on, if you had $100,000 to spend, which 10 items or 8 items would you pick to spend with that money? And do you want to look at the, there's an electrical outlet at Lyman Park that doesn't have a cover on it, so any 2-year-old can put their fingers into it. We'd recommend you fix that pretty quickly. It's a small cost, but it could have a larger liability to the town. And then,
Can I jump?
Sure.
So I had a question. Do we actually have, and I think actually Doug brought this up a long time ago, is there somebody in the city that actually manages, monitors, inspects, schedules maintenance, property maintenance, including establishing of funds for earmarking for future significant, is there somebody in charge of that, like one person?
Right.
Other than you?
In small, let me answer the question this way. In small cities, I think, particularly in small cities that have gone through a deep recession, budget cuts influence the available resources. And we have staff that are responsible for maintenance. But my observation is that small cities sometimes are challenged with taking the time and investing the resources necessary to prioritize the work that should be done in an optimal setting. And my observation is that we don't have a current formal strategy that plans moving forward and looks forward. But that's exactly what this work is intended to do, is to build that database, build a strategy on how if we're going to make investments in resources. I'm interested, and I know the community and the committee and the council are interested in making sure that we maintain anything that we repair or replace. And so that's really the value of this exercise, and will be the foundation for how we begin to manage these assets over time. So I hope that's helpful.
You didn't factor that into the costs of all of this?
In terms of staff time, no. We're just looking at construction costs.
Because it seems to me that, as we talked about, the first thing that ought to be considered before we even consider what we're going to do with these buildings is how we have, $18 million when you add it all up, $18 million worth of property in the city, and we have not one person who's in charge of maintaining them, and hence we've ended up with this problem. So to move forward with figuring out how to repair them and not have a structure in place with somebody who's not just a parks guy part-time here, but we need a general contractor who has the skills to actually do this, and then maybe a couple of staff guys. They can come internally. I'm not suggesting we put more bodies on staff here, but maybe there are a couple guys who can actually pull it off that aren't janitorial, but are in fact people who could handle the maintenance of a facility.
Well,
individually, if I owned $18 million worth of buildings, 10 of them, believe me, the first thing I'd hire is the guy who can take care of them.
Well, as Mark was saying, once you have the database to start with, it's easier for staff to manage it.
Right.
But it's harder for staff to create it. So you've done this process now
and
to
this is
create
why
that.
this is fantastic, but it'll take a skilled person, not somebody who's not skilled, to even manage what you've given him, this information, before he can also manage carpenters and electricians and plumbers. So it's a very skilled person that we need, and then some staff for that guy.
Yeah, when you analyze maintenance departments, there usually is a maintenance planner position that's identifying what to do in the future. and not just looking at current repairs, but what to do 3 months or 6 months from now.
And right now, what we have is a guy who seems like a really great guy, but his basic function is to throw a tarp over the holes.
Mm-hmm. And then we did want to talk a little bit about next steps, because we have some, I'm not sure if it's recommendations, but suggestions might be a better word. But again, it's the committee looking at what to do next and how to look at the buildings. One of the benefits of the FCI is to look at the FCI and see if a building, when compared to the space analysis, is not meeting your needs, do you really want to repair it? And so that's a decision that staff and the committee can work together to see, do you want to not focus on a building for repairing because you're planning on repurposing or selling it, or do you want to work on the buildings that are in the worst condition? So we recommend looking at that FCI number and comparing the buildings to each other, and then working with the prioritization. It may be that some of the properties are worth more without the building on it. The appraiser did bring that up in their discussions about some of the buildings are like the Public Works Corporation yard. The buildings are not in great shape, so that there may be an option to discuss further within the appraisals about, if we took a building down, does that increase the value of the parcel? And so that's something to consider, or that you may need to make repairs to sell a building, and that's where your financial consultant can say, the same way a realtor would for a single-family house, fix these items and then sell the building. So that's some discussion that may go on if you're in that situation. And then, as we talked earlier, there may be some development restrictions that are on the deeds. The appraisers did not have access to title reports to do their appraisals. They were looking at just the conditions on the building and the parcel size and comparable parcels around the county or around the city, that they did not have access to the title reports. And then in terms of City Hall, if we've discussed already, there's repair options, there's renovation, there's relocating to another building that might be existing or another parcel. I know some other cities in the area have traded parcels with developers. And I think at least one city had the developer build a city hall, and then they traded properties, or built a commercial building that would fit city hall, and they traded properties. And so there's real estate solutions that are beyond what EMG can do that may be an option for you to consider. And then, as we said earlier, switching the teen center and former CDF building into 2 lots instead of 1 appears to increase the value and increase the flexibility. At the same time, that's a large parcel, and there may be development options for that parcel, either by the city or by somebody else that you're selling the parcel to.
How do we do that second point, the review 9th Street right-of-way? Who can do that?
Well, that's really working with the city staff to see, is that, in terms of that city, that the city council can abandon a right-of-way. That's one of the, if they go through a specific process. They can't just bring it up on the agenda and vote on it. There is a specific process for that, but they can abandon a right-of-way or modify a right-of-way with proper public notice and discussion. And so that would be more with talking, if the city has a city engineer or someone who's contracted to be the city engineer, you'd have to talk to them. And it also gets back to whatever deed restrictions were established or what council action was taken when the fire station was built. They may have to go back and reanalyze that decision to see if they can change it or not. And again, that's information we don't have. We're just looking at it from specifically a planning standpoint, saying that a right-of-way that jogs to the right and then jogs back to the left and looks like a public parking space is restricting what the staff can do with police department parking and access to the buildings, and there may be an opportunity to simplify that if you adjust the right-of-way. And then at that point, that's really then a matter of other questions or other things you want to discuss about our work. That was what we were planning on presenting tonight.
I don't know if it's appropriate to ask you, and maybe it's something that we review more with Cosmot, but I do have a few questions about the appraisals.
Okay.
And I know, so I guess part of my concern was the appraisals didn't actually include any of the comparable sales data. It just said, we looked at, there were, I think, City Hall, Carnegie Building, I think City Hall said the same thing, and maybe the CDF. It said we looked at, 6 comparables that happened within St. Helena. And I'm not, they're the professionals. They do this all day long, but at the same time, I've looked at a lot of appraisals too. And did those 6 comparables happen over a 4-year period? There's not that much activity in St. Helena. Did it happen over a 4-year period? Did it happen over an 18-month period? What really were the comparables? How did the values swing? Not having that data, it's hard
we can
to get really comfortable with the appraisal numbers.
Okay, we can ask
I would
for
imagine
that, yeah.
Jeff probably has the same problem with the appraisal numbers. Because you look at this stuff and you really want to look at the details, because how they decide one's inferior and one's superior and this and that and the other thing, you have your own calls on that. And then to what extent did they really consider the historical registered property issues with regards to Carnegie? You need more information. And it seems like they're using, for many of the properties, they're using the same 6 comparables.
Well, and I can ask them for that backup, and I know that you often see that in an appraisal in an appendix where the documentation on comparables is. So we can
Just
ask
because
for
it's
that,
a risk
yeah.
for us. If we're going to think that the property has this ability to be sold for something, when we're throwing all this stuff in the black box in the big model that Tim's going to build for us, we need to know how good that number is. And so I think some of us at least want to dig into the details to feel a little better about the number.
Okay, we can ask for that. Yes,
Okay.
that's.
Oh, and by the way, I actually sort of looked at this while you guys were doing other things. On page 9 of the City Hall appraisal, under site description, it says that City Hall shares the property with the fire department. So either that's right or wrong, but that is where I came up with that. And so it doesn't share, it basically saying it doesn't share it with Lyman Park.
Of the appraisal. That's not the
the appraisal
report. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, we
Which
can take
was
a look
like
at that and
page
clarify
752 or something. I don't know.
that. Yeah. Well, so are there other questions? Or as I said before, these are draft reports, and we will take comments and questions today, and the staff is still reviewing them also. And so their final reports will be issued at a later date.
Just since it is a draft report, if a couple things you might want to look at. There is different information. I think there was like 3 or 4 sections where, like Head Start, it said there were, I think, 10 part-time folks, but then somewhere else it said 4, and that happened in a couple of different places. So you may want to make sure that the people stuff is all consistent with different charts in different places.
I also would like to mention that I can't find the page right now, but where the study shows floodplains, it shows it incorrectly for Vineyard Valley. And after all the years and work that went into getting Vineyard Valley out of a floodplain,
Yeah, you gave me that
I gave
map already. Yes.
him the FEMA map, the insurance map, showing that it's on page 31.
Yeah, it looked like they were using an old map from like 2008 or 9 or something like that, not a current map.
Okay.
In the Head Start building, did you guys look at the plumbing and the sewage for commercial use, if that building were to be used for something more than just for the toddlers?
We did not consider it in terms of a change of use and how that might affect the plumbing lines, no.
Okay.
It currently has, I think, 3 small children toilet closets, and then the public restrooms.
Yeah, or a mess.
And yeah, so if you're considering it changing the use, you'd need to do a sewer line scope with closed circuit TV and look at maybe do a water pressure test and look at that before you could convert it.
Right. And that back part of the park seems to be kind of unused almost back there. It's certainly not all of the landscaping every place could use more money and more effort, but there's a huge parcel back there around that building that's really seemingly unused, which might be useful if it were combined with that Head Start building into something, if there were potential commercial use for that.
Oh, the fenced-in area.
No, not just that for sure, but if you go all the way back, if you look back behind there, the park continues back there, and there's a little round of picnic tables stuck
It's a
back there.
park?
And there's a lot of park back there, but nobody's ever back there. So it might be, some of that could be used with that building to improve the value of that building if we wanted to consider that as potentially useful for another purpose other than just Head Start.
This is another request to maybe change something in the draft, because we are going to be referring to these documents in the future quite a bit, I think. Can you add totals? There's a lot of tables in here that have, like here's the appraised values, but there's no total of all the appraised values, which I added up on my own. But, I mean, it'd be nice if we have a lot of schedules that have individual numbers, but then there's no total. Whether it's the total of the current year repair costs or it's the total of the appraised values or whatever it might be. It'd be great if schedules could also have totals on them. Thanks.
And I mentioned some of the inconsistencies earlier. I assume you guys will scrub through the
We've already been doing
reports
that,
to
yes.
look at all. Okay, so I started to write a bunch of them down, and I won't bother to give them to you because if people are cross-checking.
Yeah, we've already been doing that,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, great. I had one other. This is sort of a really trivial one, but it just caught my eye. It said the total area of the library building is consistent with libraries in other towns of similar size. I looked at I think you only had 2 other libraries sizes listed, and they weren't even close to our size. Is it true that 6,000-person towns around the country typically have 17,000 square foot libraries?
It's within a range. It's probably a little larger than some of them, and again,
Okay. I did a quick Google search on, and just kind of the first 4 that came up were Capitola, Cambria, Westlake Village, and Dixon, and we're more than twice as big as any of those, and all of those places are bigger towns than us. So it just caught my eye. It's like,
Okay.
wow, there are some big libraries out there in small towns. I mean, ours is pretty spectacular compared to most places. It just
right, and that total does include the museum that's at the library in terms of the total area. But yes, it is a large facility. It's a nice facility, except for the crack in the wall.
yeah. Okay, thanks.
Did we find out more about the separation of that? Is it okay for me to go in the library, I guess is my question? I mean,
It's okay. We had a structural engineer take a look at both the library and the Scout Hall, given the report. And the current assessment is that it's not a significant concern, but we are doing additional analysis, as was mentioned, and so that may influence additional thinking and action on it, but at the moment it's not a significant concern.
so in Appendix A of this, I think it's the space analysis, you have listed a few cities and or municipalities. They could be towns, I guess. And certain properties they have. I guess, why these? Are these just ones you guys worked on?
Yes, they're ones that we have in our database where we know
Versus-
what the areas are.
Versus actually going out and trying to find a lot of 6,000, citizen towns and getting information on them versus.
Well, it wasn't really in our scope to start calling them all to ask what their building areas are. And so we took advantage of other cities that we've worked with and what sizes of city halls they have and how their population relates to yours to give you some ideas of what other cities are doing.
And then I'm wondering if we should just be strictly using, which we are at some level or another, populations of these municipalities. And quite frankly, I don't know anything about Quincy, Washington, or Waterford, California. And I don't know if they're sort of similarly set up as we are, but I'm wondering if we should really be from a population standpoint and then saying, well, is our library right-sized or is it not? Should we be looking at maybe the sphere of influence that St. Helena has? Because there's really, I think there's a grocery store at Angwin, but there's not a lot up there, and you got Rutherford and you got the rural areas, and so is our population really the population of St. Helena, or are we really serving something where we have a bigger influence over more folks.
Just a brief comment on that. What's interesting is that the city's sphere of influence, which is the probable future boundaries of the city of St. Helena's future probable boundaries are the current city boundaries. So that line is essentially the same line, and the city doesn't control its future probable boundaries. That is determined by a local agency formation commission of Napa County, a 7-member body that has local government representation and a public member. And so looking forward into the future, I don't anticipate a lot of change in terms of the current footprint for the city.
Okay, well, maybe I used the wrong term. You're talking about city boundaries, but for instance, there's a development south of town, just north of Zinfandel Lane, that's not in the city of St. Helena, but certainly they come to us for services and whatnot. And I mean, so I guess that's what I'm just trying to get at, that maybe we should be considering ourselves larger than what our population is. I mean, I know the school district's larger than the city, and they consider, so if you look at the population associated with the school districts, it's bigger than the population of St. Helena. And I think we kind of both have a similar, everybody comes to our town.
From a service delivery standpoint, in some cases we are providing service in the form of water. In most cases, the most likely service we're providing is water. Sometimes recreational services, wastewater, probably not, but we have potential to serve a number of properties in terms of that. But for other services that are being provided, they would likely be provided by the county as opposed to the city. But from a master planning standpoint and scale of city hall facility type of building, I really think that the number that we're working with today, to me, feels like a pretty safe number to rely on. And I don't, even if the city happen to annex additional property down the road, I don't necessarily see a need for substantial increases in space requirements for the city. There are economies of scale that come from the growth in cities, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we need an additional staff member. So I think in some cases there are economies of scale that just will occur naturally with the same number of staff, and obviously technology helps to contribute to some of that.
Just to kind of reiterate, just for clarity, I just want to know, are these appraised values going to be revisited, or this is it? What's happening here?
Well, I think you've asked some questions about comparables. So in terms of the reports, we'll make some adjustments for that. In terms of the appraised values, it may get back to what city staff finds in terms of deed restrictions. If they find a significant deed restriction, then that might be communicated back to the appraiser, and they might decide that has an impact on value.
Would it be fair to have a range? Because a lot of this is commercial, and you just give it some, fancy entitlements, and they could double the value.
And again, that's more what your cost or financial consultant might be looking at. The appraiser was really just to pick this point in time and establish a value based on current conditions. And it does start to become, it's that December value, not the June of next year value. So, but with all the properties together, you can still use that number to compare them against each other.
I'm sort of wondering if we could consider the time and the fact that we have 2 more items on the agenda. It's 8:30, and that's when we're supposed to end.
I'm going to look at the calendar here later.
We have 2 more items on the agenda.
The subsequent items won't take too long, and we have tried to plan your meetings to adjourn within about 2 to 2.5 hours. So feel good that we've seemed to be hitting that mark again tonight.
I just had one question for Mark Prestwich. And Mark, you mentioned, we've kind of talked about 11,000, 13,000 square feet for the city hall. And what would help me understand a little bit more is does that 13,000 square feet include all the different departments of the city? Does that include the police department? Would there be a better way in your mind? I mean, you've got the fresh set of eyes. You come from a background of experience of being in other places saying, hey, this would be better here, that would be better there. And if you have any suggestions like that, for example, like, it'd be great to have the public works guys here and the police department here, anything like that that might help us better look at this and get the right answer to the better questions would be helpful. So if you have anything you want to shed light on moving forward, it'd be great to hear.
Okay.
Yeah, the 13,000 does include the police department. Yes. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, we appreciated the time you took tonight to look at things, and we like to work with people that are really interested in improving things and looking at our reports. And once again, it's been good working with city staff. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I should ask, there are some people in the public, does anybody have any questions with regards to the EMG report? No? Okay. So we can move on to 5.2, which is the calendar. The
Thank you, Chair.
tentative calendar.
Yes, as we've mentioned several times, the calendar is fluid. One of the reasons the calendar is fluid is the availability of various people on various nights and so forth. And so the availability of EMG, the availability of Cosmont companies and others, facilitator, have influenced the calendar as we look over the next 7 weeks. So this is a fairly educated guess of how we think things will unfold, and we do have, I want to walk through those dates for you, so we also have some feedback. Next week, I have some homework that I'll cover for you on the next item on the agenda. That homework will turn into item number 1 on the agenda next week on the 24th. The second item on the agenda, in working with our facilitator who is available that night, we are anticipating a exercise where we will break into groups and begin to talk about each of these buildings, which I know you're very interested in doing. And we want to capture that data. First, it's really just an initial look at thinking so that we can inventory some initial thoughts and bring those back to you at a later date. So there will be a group exercise facilitated by a facilitator. On the 31st, we are proposing no meeting because of the availability of others and timing of and sequencing of the items that are being brought forward to the committee. The Cosmont companies are scheduled to participate in the meeting of February 7th. The entire focus of that meeting will be largely dedicated to asset strategy, which will encompass how cities finance these investments, how do they plan for maintenance, how do they consider looking at different properties if we have potential excess property, how might we leverage that property. So that will be a very engaging conversation. And by the way, the Cosmont companies are under contract to work with the committee over 3 different meetings. So we're anticipating this is sort of the basics, and then they will come back after the committee's had an opportunity to express some thinking on the various assets, and they will be available as a resource to help you narrow the focus of your thinking. And then they would be available again as the refining takes place near the end of this process. And so they will be with us for the ride through the remainder of this process. Wednesday, February 14th, one of the questions for us is do the committee members and do the public have other plans that night that may conflict with the plan to have a meeting? So that's a question that would be helpful to have some feedback on, because it's, again, a flexible schedule. It doesn't have to happen that night, and if the committee would prefer to postpone that meeting, we can do that. The plan for that night would be to begin to we will bring you some frameworks, very similar to what Mr. Neiman has expressed, some frameworks for you to think about and react to, so that the decision-making framework will become, the committee will weigh in on how they prefer to move forward on the decision-making. So the plan that evening would be to introduce a couple of different strategies and refine the approach that the committee would like to work with. That can be postponed. The week of the 21st, we have scheduled for community workshops. One of the concurrent activities that the staff is working on outside of really the committee's domain, but the staff is working on as a community workshop. We are anticipating holding that first workshop on Wednesday the 21st in this room at this time, which we've reserved, with a secondary workshop the following afternoon on Thursday the 22nd at a different location to be determined. The focus of those workshops will be to share with the community the EMG findings and report and all of the data that has been gathered to date, and again do some group exercise and provide you feedback from the community on the information that they're seeing. And that would be shared with you at the following meeting on the 28th of February. And conceptually, this is, as we get a little farther at it, becomes a bit more conceptual. We are anticipating the follow-through on that design of the framework would lead to some secondary decision-making as the committee begins to look at various proposals for each facility. And then on March 7th, we anticipate having the long-range financial forecast completed by that date and shared with you, which will help inform some of the decision-making, and the Cosmont companies are holding that date as well to continue to the discussion of financing and asset management.
Thanks. And one thing I would like to add to that is when these community workshops, we all need to do our own outreach as far as encouraging everybody around town to go to these, because we want to get as much involvement as possible. So once those dates are set, which I guess one of them is, but they'll both be set, and then it'll be announced, and the city will be getting information out there to everybody. We really want to call and knock on the doors and talk to neighbors and get people out there, because we really want a demographically diverse group of people showing up to these meetings. And I think the meetings are going to be at two different times, right? One's going to be in the evening and one's going to be in the afternoon. So hopefully, depending, people should be able to find one meeting or the other to go to. So I wanted to encourage that. So I don't know if anybody has any questions about the calendar or other items. I mean, what we're trying to do here is build so that you can sort of anticipate and see how it's moving along and how we're going to sort of bring this thing together. So this is, and obviously it's subject to change, but this is what it looks like right now.
So the initial, I guess the question about the 14th would be helpful to know if the committee is available that evening, if they anticipate the community of St. Helena would be available that evening to participate in the meetings. It's a date that the staff is available to assist, but happy to work with the committee if we would like to move that date.
Is that Valentine's Day?
It's Valentine's Day and also Ash Wednesday.
Oh, and Ash Wednesday. Oh.
I'm fine. I don't.
I'd like to postpone it,
I'm out of town that day.
I have to look at my calendar. I don't know, to be honest with you. Probably available, but
Well, maybe everybody can look at their calendars and we can come back to that one at the next meeting, confirm it or not.
Okay.
If we did, could we go to the next night, or how would that work? Slide everything back a week? What's the cumulative effect of not having that meeting? Do we just do it the next night? Is that a possibility, or is it just we just push everything back a week?
We would need to work with the school to determine if the room is available on a night, either the next night or a night before or the following week on an alternate date. So we would need to do a little homework on that.
So the easiest solution is really just to keep the date and keep chugging
The
along.
easiest is to keep it or postpone that discussion until the 28th.
Got it. Thanks.
Well, And then if we did that, we'd probably push the 28th out a week and the next thing out. I mean, so we'd probably just leapfrog the workshops and then push it out a week, I'm guessing.
So we may want to, the staff may, don't be surprised if we send you a survey, because we do need to validate that there is a quorum available for the meeting in order to hold the meeting. So and I know there are a few folks missing, but we're happy to make sure that we at least have a quorum that would be available that night.
It'd probably be easier if Allison just sent out something to everybody, and then everybody could shoot back to Allison and say whether they think they can do the 14th or want to do the 14th or whatever.
Okay. And in transitioning to the final item on the agenda, what we were referring to as focus group recruitment, we talked a couple of meetings ago about various groups in town that you would recommend and be incorporated into a focus group activity. So we're in the process of planning those, and we are inviting your homework tonight and over the course of the next couple of days. What we would like to receive from you is your ideas on who to be included in those focus groups. What we will do is inventory all of those ideas and bring them back to you at the next meeting next week. So it would be helpful for us to receive that from you by the end of the week. What we would like you to do is work through the chair. So email your ideas to the chair, and then the chair will work with staff to organize those. But essentially, imagine groups of 8 to 10. No limit necessarily at the moment on numbers, but just your ideas on what demographics would you like to see, or essentially demographics that you would like to see in a focus group. So that will be your homework tonight and over the next couple of days, and we'll bring that data to you at the following meeting.
I guess I'm not clear on what you mean by demographics. Like,
So-
do we want 25-year-olds and that sort of thing, or are you suggesting specific groups around town?
We talked about different ideas a couple of meetings ago. So, for example, the business community, or parents of school-age children, or residents of particular neighborhoods, seniors. I mean, any type of demographic that you would recommend. We can also cross-section the community, so it can be a random sample and just get essentially a random sample of community members. That's another approach that may be valuable to include. Young people can be another demographic that you might want to include. So just your ideas that in terms of, if we're bringing small groups of people together to ask them questions about city amenities, civic amenities, the condition of these buildings, who would you like to have feedback from?
Okay, so these are general demographics. This isn't to say we're going to go grab this particular organized group in town and bring them in.
It could be an organized group. It could be, let's bring some service clubs together and have them participate in a focus group. So really...
It could be going and talking to Rotary and saying, hey, give us 9 people. We want to do a focus group with you guys. Pat, get 9 people together. We want to go do, a focus group out at, Vineyard Valley. I mean, and so it's not just what types of focus groups. It's like, okay, who do you think should be in the focus group that you just mentioned?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. I have one which I thought of at about 5 o'clock today, and we maybe can't answer it here, or maybe you can. I recall that and it's just because obviously we're going to be talking about financing all the things we're going to be talking about doing. So we're getting this, I think it's Measure A money from the flood project, and what I read, and I think we heard at one point in time from April, that money was going to go to pay off certain loans. Now, I don't know if those loans are specific to Measure A, and those loans need to be paid off with these monies that are now coming to us, but the reason I'm asking is because if you've already got the notes out there and you already got the loans and you got $5 million coming in, well, maybe we should consider putting the $5 million aside and not have to go through the whole exercise of borrowing money to go build a city hall or whatever it is. So I didn't know if that money coming through related to the flood project had to specifically go to these loans, to pay these loans off, or do we have flexibility? So I don't know if anybody has the answer to that.
It will. The answer to that question and others will come in the form of the long-range financial forecast, but the short answer is the funds are committed at the moment to paying off debt.
Are they committed because the city has decided to commit them, or are they legally committed? Legally committed. Okay. All right. Just making sure. Anything else for the good of the order? Anybody? Okay, meeting adjourned.